trying to add to what Luhmann says, but basically just present his views because I thought at least many of you will not really be familiar with his theory. He is a major social theorist of the 20th century, but his reception is very widespread. So of course there are some philosophers who work with his work, but of course also sociologists, but people in all kinds of different fields. He coined his own project in one of his books, super theory. I think that term is used with self-irony for sure. It is quite sort of fitting in the sense that his social systems theory, he took the systems theory is not his invention. He studied with Calvin Parsons at Harvard, who already developed some sort of systems theory and also particular social systems theory, but Luhmann very considerably modified that and changed that and also broadened it. So his social systems theory is ultimately, I guess, a general theory of society as a whole and the world, at least the world as a social product or as a social construct, to put it generally. So in that sense, his theory is definitely grand theory in the tradition of German idealism of the great systems of Kant and Hegel and others, and even Habermas, his sort of nemesis in the German discourse in the 1970s and 80s, or also in the 90s. Luhmann died in 1998. Even Habermas sort of rightly connected him explicitly to that great German systemic theoretical tradition of the 18th and 19th century. So he's a successor of that. However, what is important to note right from the beginning, that his theory is explicitly a theory of society. So it's not a theory of the mind, unlike Hegel or the spirit or Kant, a theory of reason. It is also not a theory of cosmos. It's not a metaphysics in that sense. So that has to be taken into account, that the focus is really very much an analysis of society. And society, this is then a second step that is very important to make. Society is understood strictly in terms of communication, which has earned him a lot of criticisms, particularly from the humanist tradition, that for him the notion of the human being is not a theoretically valid notion. Of course, he doesn't deny the existence of human beings, but he thinks that there are so many things to the human being, including whatever our bodily functions or our feelings, our social, our psychological setup and so forth, which of course plays an important part in the environment of society, in the environment of communication. If we didn't have bodies and minds, we couldn't talk, we couldn't communicate. However, the systems theory focuses on society as communication. Society is constituted by operations of communication. That is not only restricted to us talking to language, but equally important, of course, for instance, in today's world, the economy, which is also a form of communicating with non-linguistic means. Or, for instance, also the mass media, where we have images or music, and all these operations are communicative operations. At the same time, Luhmann's theory is also decidedly not static. It is a theory of society as being a constantly evolving thing. Luhmann borrows heavily or includes, in particularly, evolutionary biology, and a lot of concepts that he uses are actually borrowed from contemporary evolutionary biology. So he's not a social Darwinist in that sense. Notions of progress or improvement, which are very much, Enlightenment terms coming from the Kantian and Hegelian and the following up 19th century thought. He distanced himself quite distinctly from that, but still he's very much interested in social change and understands society as a constantly evolving again, system. Similarly, in a wider sense, to also the approach to biology, which understands life as basically an evolutionary process. So social change for Luhmann, the history, if you want, is based on the dominance of specific types of differentiation: segmentary, center-periphery, stratified, and functional differentiation. So in early societies, we have a dominance of segmentary differentiation, which is basically different tribes living next to one another, and they constitute the basic setup of a society. Then we have center-periphery differentiation. Ancient Roman world would be an example for that. Then we have stratified differentiation. In a Marxist term, this would be class society, feudal society, where the basic structures of society correspond to the different social strata. Now, in contemporary times, according to Luhmann, we live in a period where functional differentiation dominates. It doesn't mean that the other forms of differentiation no longer exist, but functional differentiation is the dominating feature of our social structures. So that means society is now the main basic sort of social structure, is in accordance with the different social function systems that are listed here: politics, law, economy, education, academics, and also religion, which represent different types of communication. And according to Luhmann, this new form of social differentiation evolved in Europe between the 16th and 18th century, and is nowadays a global phenomenon. We live in a world society that is based on functional differentiation. An important aspect is that these function systems evolve and reproduce themselves autopoietically. That is, they are not set up by any sort of intelligent design, either by a divine origin or by humans taking control. Just like biological evolution is not controlled by bodies themselves who decide, how they would like to evolve. All the systems are defined by specific communication codes, and they all co-evolve and enter into couplings with one another, so they influence one another, but they remain operationally closed, which is an important aspect of the theory. That is, each type of system is characterized by and perpetuates itself by its own, let's say, mode of communication. So this, of course, means that, for instance, I cannot preach here or start dancing or something because I can only communicate and function in this setting here if I use the kind of communication that constitutes the academic system. And of course, that is the same for communicating in any social system. This is so much for a general introduction of some very basic aspects of social systems theory. I will now talk about Luhmann's theory of religion on the basis of these four texts. The first book that was originally written in German in the 1970s, but I will actually not really quote from that one, but rather from mostly the second one, which was published posthumously, Die Religion der Gesellschaft, or Systems Theory of Religion, which also not that long ago appeared in English translation. So that's the mature human, very mature, because it was published after his death. And then a short section on religion and morality in his major work, his great summary of his theory, published shortly before his death in two huge volumes, A Theory of Society. So I'll quote from these two works. And then in addition, I will refer to the section on religion in Glossario Niklas Luhmann by Baraldi, Cosi and Esposito, which is, I think, the best secondary work on Luhmann that is available, and basically everything you need to know about Luhmann is also in that book, in case you need some sort of, or you have interest in further reading. Now, as a social system, and this is important to point out right from the beginning, religion cannot be explained, for instance, on the basis of certain metaphysical entities that we somehow, must relate to, some sort of beyond, or let's say some existential human needs, like whatever need for salvation, and also not on the basis of mental experiences, or let's say on the basis of some sort of specific humans, some founders that we found somewhere, some great religious people, because none of these are strictly speaking social or communicational phenomena. So if you want to understand religion from the Luhmannian perspective, from the social systems perspective, we have to understand its mode of communicative function. And all these other aspects may play a role in the environment of religious communication, but again, they are not part of the operational processes of religious communication as a social system as such. So there, of course, are mental and cognitive religious experiences, there are specific humans, there are existential needs and so forth, but they operate in the environment of religion as a social system and not within it. So I quote here from Luhmann's text or book on the religion of society, and I have like 2 or 3 quotes now which distinguish his approach to religion very much explicitly from the approach to religion that was presented here a few weeks ago when there was a conference here on religion as cognition, and so I thought I'd just point out these things because it shows that his approach is very, very different from this attempt to sort of cognitively explain what religion is on the basis of cognitive science. Luhmann says, as quote, in the context of sociological theory, religion can be understood exclusively as communication. It's not to be denied that consciousness processes play a role. There is no communication without consciousness, but the realization of religion, just as the realization of social order in general, cannot be conceived of as an aggregate of operations of consciousness. If so, one would deal with an extreme unlikeliness, as if detonating a rock of marble would result in a sculpture by Michelangelo, right? So, of course, there are cognitive features in the environment of religion that somehow religious communication sort of uses as a resource, just as someone who sculptures a statue will use marble as a resource, but it is not possible to define art on the basis of the resources external to it that art. So it would be like an extreme reductionism that doesn't really say anything specific about religion as a social system. So, in this sense, cognitive or biological operations cannot be reduced or causally related to social operations or phenomena, or vice versa. The features of religion as a social phenomenon are described within the theory of society, not within the theory of cognition. Otherwise, one would resemble an art historian who wants to explain Michelangelo's sculptures by examining art. That would be trivial. So, 2 more quotes. An analysis of the specific features of consciousness can never explain religion, and in particular cannot explain the evolution of highly developed forms of religion in society. The condition of the socio-cultural evolution of communicative autopoiesis is that communication is highly indifferent, and at the same time in a specific way is determined by itself sensitive to what is happening simultaneously in consciousness. So that is the complexity that develops in society, that on the one hand is indifferent, it is not causally determined, it is not causally dependent, causally steered by consciousness operations, but at the same time it has the capacity as a high sensitivity to react to whatever happens in consciousness or in fact in any other realm within its environment. So it doesn't mean that it's not tied to cognition, but it's not caused or determined by cognitive operations as a social system. Now to the evolution of religion. Religion is very old. It's one of the earliest social systems and existed long before functional differentiation. Its emergence and thus its code and function is directly related, according to Luhmann, to the most basic features of communication or social sense-making, which is the same thing, namely that it is an observation that makes a distinction. That is pure systems theoretical technical terminology, and we will have to explain that very briefly. So, a basic systems theory. Systems theory is a theory based on the notion of observation. An observation is very technically put just making a distinction. By making a distinction, for instance, I use here the Hegelian sort of refer here to the beginning of the consciousness section in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, which is sort of takes a similar beginning, but then for Hegel, of course, this is developed into a theory of the mind, whereas Luhmann develops this distinction-making into a theory of communication. So by making a distinction, for instance, between this and that, or now and then, something is designated or indicated, or bezeichnet in his terminology. Of course, by indicating something, by this rather than that, here rather than there, now rather than then, something else is not indicated. So in this sense, every indication or designation distinguishes a marked space. It sets a mark. And thereby it creates also an unmarked space, that which is not designated or not indicated. Right? So that is a very, very basic, that's the beginning of systems theory, as a theory of observation, which at the same time is distinction making, which at the same time also implies or is designation and indication. Now, religion, according to Luhmann, this very old, earliest social system, is directly tied, the emergence of religion as a form of communication, is directly related to those, let's say, most primitive characteristics of observation. Every observation needs to distinguish in order to be able to designate something. Thereby it separates out, this is a quote, by the way, thereby it separates out an unmarked space into which the final horizon of the world retreats, that which is not marked, that which is left out by the distinction maker. The transcendent, which thereby accompanies everything conceivable, moves with every attempt to cross the boundary with new distinctions and designations. It's always present as the other side of everything determinate, but it remains beyond reach. Right? So that's a quote from the Society of Society. So in this sense, this inaccessibility binds the observer to that which he can designate. The rebinding of that which cannot be designated to that which can be designated is, in whatever cultural shape, religio in the wider sense. So these again are two quotes. Or more simply, the origins of religion can best be understood as semantics and practices distinguishing between the familiar and the unfamiliar. So by every sense making, every observation, every distinction making creates this unmarked space, this which is not being designated. And to sort of recuperate that which is not designated into our communicative practices, thereby this is the origin of religion. And thereby we reflect communicatively, we observe that which was sort of left out as the unmarked space. And we thereby connect communicatively to that. So here we have, very simply put, the origin of the transcendent, or the apophatic, to refer to use Williams' terminology. Again, quote here, every communication references something that cannot be observed. In this sense, all communication implies religion, because all communication has already separated out that which it designates from that which it doesn't designate. Or this is like, if we use a simple sort of Sprichwort, wo gehobelt wird, fallen Späne, where wood is chopped, splinters must fall. Every marking creates this unmarked space. And then the transcendent or apophatic is in this sense the unintended byproduct, or in my metaphor here, the illegitimate child of all sense making, including like the most rudimentary form of sense making or communication. Right? So it is a byproduct that every sense making inevitably produces, but of course which is very different than from, let's say, the major, that's why I use this metaphor. Luhmann's take is very different from, let's say, the major metaphorical trend of apophatic philosophy, sort of culminating with Heidegger or so, and we heard a lot of it also in the previous presentations, that looks at the apophatic as some sort of ground or mother in the Chinese context, right? For Luhmann, it's just like a byproduct of sense making. So this sort of illegitimate child. Now, so the peculiarity of religion, again, quote, is how it deals with the difference observable, unobservable, and makes it its major issue. So the origin of religious communication is reflecting, basically, the communicative reaction to